Healing doesn't make you better. It makes you unfamiliar to others and eventually to yourself. Healing does not announce itself with clarity. It begins quietly, almost invisibly, as a subtle discomfort with the version of yourself that once felt familiar. The habits that kept you safe start to feel heavy. The reactions that once came automatically begin to slow. You notice yourself pausing where you used to complain, questioning where you used to endure, and withdrawing where you once overextended. At first, this feels like confusion, not growth. What no one explains is that healing dismantles identity before it builds integrity. The personality you lived through pain was not random, it was precise, adaptive, and necessary. It learned how to read rooms, manage emotions, anticipate danger, and preserve connection at any cost. When healing begins, that entire internal system is challenged. The traits people praised you for, your patience, your empathy, your flexibility, start to dissolve, and what replaces them does not look impressive to the outside world. You become harder to read. You stop offering instant emotional access. You no longer rush to smooth discomfort or rescue others from their feelings. This shift unsettles people because they were bonded to your coping mechanisms, not your essence. When those mechanisms disappear, the relationship itself feels unfamiliar. They call it distance, they call it coldness, they call it ego, but what they are reacting to is the loss of predictability. Healing makes you unrecognizable because it removes the parts of you that were shaped by fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of conflict, fear of being misunderstood. As those fears loosen their grip, your behavior changes in ways that cannot be easily explained. You say no without rehearsing. You leave without justifying. You choose silence where you once over-explained. This feels unnatural at first because your nervous system was trained to equate safety with performance. There is also an internal unrecognizability that feels more disorienting than the external one. You no longer resonate with your old motivations. Approval stops driving you. Intensity stops exciting you. Chaos stops feeling like home. This creates a strange emptiness, not because something is missing, but because something artificial has been removed. The psyche needs time to adjust to stability when it has only known survival. Healing interrupts unconscious loyalty. You realize how much of your behavior was designed to keep others comfortable, not to honor your own truth. When that realization lands, it brings grief. Not just for the pain you endured, but for the self you sacrificed to belong. As that grief is processed, a firmer self emerges, one that does not bend instinctively or explain reflexively. This self is quieter, slower, and far less performative. People often mistake this groundedness for withdrawal. In reality, it is consolidation. Energy that once leaked outward through overgiving and hypervigilance is now contained. You feel less urgency to be seen, understood, or validated. Conversations become more selective. Emotional access becomes intentional. You begin to recognize that not everyone deserves the healed version of you, especially those who benefited from your wounded one. Healing also strips away moral confusion. You become more aware of your shadow, your limits, your boundaries, your capacity to disengage. This awareness makes you less reactive, but more responsible. You can no longer hide behind innocence or self-blame. You see your patterns clearly, and that clarity changes how you move through the world. You stop explaining yourself because explanation was a survival strategy, not a requirement. Over time, the unrecognizability stabilizes. What felt like loss begins to feel like coherence. You are no longer fragmented across roles and expectations. You are less accessible but more present, less agreeable but more honest, less impressive but more real. The people who knew you before healing may struggle to locate you in this new form because you no longer orbit their needs or narratives. Healing does not make you better in the way society defines improvement. It makes you truer, and truth often looks unfamiliar when people were attached to your adaptation. The cost of healing is the death of who you had to be and the birth of someone who does not need to be recognized to exist. No one tells you that healing often costs you every place you once belonged. Belonging is often the first casualty of healing. It does not disappear all at once. It erodes quietly as you begin to see the invisible contracts that once held your relationships together. These contracts were rarely spoken, yet deeply binding. Be agreeable. Stay small. Absorb tension. Do not disrupt the emotional balance of the group. When healing begins, you start violating these rules without intending to, simply by becoming more conscious. The sense of exile that follows can feel brutal. You may still be physically present in the same circles, families, or communities, yet emotionally absent. Conversations that once felt alive now feel scripted. Jokes no longer land. Shared grievances lose their glue. This is not because you have outgrown people intellectually, but because you are no longer participating in the same unconscious dynamics that once created connection. What once felt like belonging begins to feel like self-betrayal. Most forms of belonging are built on mutual adaptation, not mutual authenticity. People bond over shared wounds, shared roles, shared enemies, and shared illusions. When you start healing, those shared reference points dissolve. You stop bonding through pain. You stop performing loyalty through self-abandonment. You stop proving love by tolerating what diminishes you. This creates a vacuum where connection used to live, and the emptiness can feel like rejection even when no one has explicitly pushed you away. There is a particular grief in realizing that much of your sense of home came from being needed rather than being known. When healing reduces your compulsion to rescue, fix, or carry emotional weight for others, your value in certain relationships diminishes. People may not know how to relate to you without your over-functioning. The loss is subtle, but profound. You are no longer essential in the ways that once guaranteed inclusion. This phase often triggers a deep existential loneliness. Not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of standing between worlds. You no longer belong to your old life, yet you have not fully integrated into a new one. The psyche is in transition, and transitional spaces are inherently uncomfortable. There is no familiar language for this in-between state, which makes it easy to interpret it as personal failure rather than psychological reorganization. Healing also exposes how conditional many forms of belonging truly were. Approval was offered when you complied. Affection was available when you stayed predictable. Safety was granted when you did not challenge the system. As these conditions become visible, you can no longer unsee them. The cost of awareness is the inability to return to unconscious participation, even when doing so would restore a sense of comfort. This loss of belonging is not a punishment. It is a necessary withdrawal from collective identities that suppress individuation. The psyche cannot become whole while remaining fused with groups that require fragmentation to maintain harmony. Healing demands separation before integration. It asks you to endure disconnection long enough to discover who you are without borrowed identities and inherited roles. During this period, the nervous system may interpret solitude as danger. Humans are wired for connection, and the absence of familiar bonds can activate primal fear. You may question your choices, romanticize your past, or feel tempted to re-enter old dynamics simply to escape the discomfort of aloneness. This is not weakness. It is the body mourning the loss of what once ensured survival. Gradually, something shifts. The ache of not belonging transforms into a quieter clarity. You begin to sense that the loneliness is not empty, but spacious. There is room to breathe, to reflect, to hear your own inner voice without interference. The self that emerges in this space is not shaped by consensus or obligation, but by alignment. Wholeness does not arrive with instant connection. It arrives with internal coherence, and that coherence eventually attracts relationships that do not require self-erasure to sustain. Once you see clearly, you can never unsee, and that clarity comes with a psychological price. Awareness is often praised as enlightenment, as if seeing more automatically makes life easier. In reality, awareness initially feels like weight. The moment perception sharpens, ignorance loses its protective function. What once passed unnoticed now demands attention. Patterns emerge where there was once confusion, and with those patterns comes responsibility. You can no longer claim innocence through unknowing, and that loss is heavier than most people anticipate. As awareness deepens, the psyche becomes less efficient at self-deception. You start noticing your motives before your actions, your defenses before your explanations, your projections before your accusations. This internal transparency disrupts the comfort of old narratives. You realize how often you mistook coping for character, how frequently you labeled survival strategies as personality traits. This realization does not feel liberating at first. It feels destabilizing. Awareness complicates relationships. You see the unspoken agreements, the emotional manipulations, the power dynamics that once felt normal. Conversations take on a double layer: what is being said and what is actually being exchanged beneath the surface. You become aware of how much connection relies on mutual blindness. When one person begins to see clearly, the relationship itself becomes strained, not because of cruelty, but because the shared illusion has been broken. There is also a moral weight that accompanies awareness. You recognize your capacity to harm, not just your wounds. You see how your silence can enable dysfunction, how your compliance can reinforce unhealthy systems, how your avoidance can masquerade as peace. This awareness removes the comfort of victimhood. You are no longer only shaped by what happened to you. You are accountable for how you respond now. That accountability is sobering. Awareness slows you down. Automatic reactions give way to conscious choice, and choice requires energy. You can no longer act on impulse without noticing the consequences. You feel the internal tension between what is easy and what is aligned. This tension is exhausting, especially in a world that rewards speed, certainty, and confidence. Awareness introduces hesitation, and hesitation is often misinterpreted as weakness. The burden of awareness also includes grief. You grieve the time you lived unconsciously, the relationships sustained by denial, the versions of yourself that were built on incomplete understanding. You mourn the simplicity of believing that love alone could heal everything, that good intentions were enough, that endurance was synonymous with strength. Awareness reveals the limits of these beliefs, and their collapse leaves an emotional residue that must be processed. As awareness expands, solitude increases, not because you reject others, but because fewer people can meet you at this level of perception. Casual conversations feel shallow. Emotional shortcuts feel dishonest. You may find yourself speaking less, not out of superiority, but out of precision. Words carry more weight when you understand their impact, and silence becomes a form of ethical restraint rather than withdrawal. Awareness also disrupts identity. You see how much of who you were was shaped by external expectation and internalized roles. This creates an identity vacuum. You are no longer comfortable being who you were, but you are not yet certain who you are becoming. This liminal state is psychologically taxing. Without a fixed identity to lean on, you must tolerate ambiguity, and tolerance of ambiguity is a skill most people were never taught. Over time, awareness does bring a form of freedom, but it is not the freedom of ease. It is the freedom of alignment. You act less, but with more intention. You connect less, but with more honesty. You suffer less from confusion, but more from clarity. Awareness does not remove pain. It refines it, concentrating it into something meaningful rather than diffuse. The burden is not meant to crush you, but to mature you, forcing the psyche to grow strong enough to carry truth without collapsing. The most painful part of healing is realizing you no longer need anyone to understand you. The need to be understood often masquerades as a desire for connection, but beneath it lies something more fragile. It is the hope that if others truly grasp your inner world, they will treat you with care, validate your pain, and justify your choices. For many people, this need is born in environments where being misunderstood was unsafe, where explanation became a survival strategy. Healing slowly dismantles this urgency, not by making you indifferent, but by making you self-contained. As healing progresses, you begin to notice how much energy you once spent translating yourself. You explained your feelings to prevent conflict, clarified your intentions to avoid rejection, and rehearsed your pain so it would be taken seriously. This constant interpretation shaped your interactions and your sense of self. When healing loosens the fear beneath this pattern, explanation starts to feel unnecessary rather than protective. There is a moment when you realize that being understood does not guarantee being respected. People can intellectually grasp your reasons and still dismiss your boundaries. They can empathize with your story and still benefit from your self-abandonment. This realization is sobering. It shifts your focus away from persuasion and toward alignment. You stop trying to make yourself legible to those who are committed to misunderstanding you. Healing reveals that the need to be understood is often rooted in self-doubt. When you trust your own experience, external validation loses its urgency. You no longer require witnesses to confirm your reality. This internal trust changes how you communicate. You speak more simply, with less emotional charge. You allow others to have their interpretations without feeling compelled to correct them. This shift can feel like isolation at first. Without the familiar cycle of explaining and being mirrored, relationships may feel thinner. Some people will accuse you of withdrawing or becoming distant. What they are responding to is the absence of your former emotional labor. You are no longer carrying the responsibility of making yourself palatable, and that absence disrupts established dynamics. Healing also clarifies that understanding is not evenly distributed. Not everyone has the psychological capacity to hold your truth without distorting it. Some people filter everything through their own wounds, fears, and projections. When you stop seeking understanding from them, you are not rejecting connection, you are practicing discernment. This discernment protects your energy and preserves your integrity. As the need to be understood fades, silence gains value. You learn that not every feeling requires disclosure, not every insight requires explanation. Privacy becomes a form of respect for your inner life. You stop oversharing in the hope of closeness and start sharing selectively from a place of choice rather than compulsion. This selective openness creates depth rather than distance. There is also an internal shift in how you relate to misunderstanding. When others misinterpret you, it no longer triggers panic or urgency. You recognize that misunderstanding is inevitable and often harmless. You allow people to hold incomplete or inaccurate versions of you without feeling erased. This tolerance is a sign of psychological maturity, not detachment. Healing does not eliminate the desire for connection, it refines it. You still value being seen, but you no longer chase it. You recognize that genuine understanding cannot be forced or negotiated. It arises naturally in relationships where mutual presence and emotional capacity exist. Instead of explaining yourself into exhaustion, you wait for resonance. This waiting changes your pace. You move more slowly, more deliberately. You invest less in convincing and more in being. Your sense of self becomes less reactive to external perception. You know who you are without narrating it. This quiet confidence is often mistaken for indifference, but it is rooted in self-trust. When healing ends your need to be understood, it gives you something subtler and more stable. You become your own witness. Your experiences do not require translation to be valid. You carry your truth internally, no longer dependent on recognition to feel real. This inner confirmation becomes the foundation from which you relate to others, not as a plea for comprehension, but as an invitation to meet you where you already stand. Healing doesn't feel like joy at first. It feels like silence where chaos used to live. Peace rarely arrives in the way people imagine. It does not rush in with relief or celebration. It enters quietly, almost unnoticed, and its first sensation is not comfort, but absence. The absence of urgency, the absence of tension, the absence of emotional noise that once filled every corner of your inner life. For a nervous system accustomed to constant stimulation, this absence feels unsettling rather than soothing. When chaos has been familiar for a long time, calm registers as loss. The mind searches for problems because problems once provided structure. Worry created direction. Conflict generated intensity. Emotional highs and lows made life feel meaningful. When peace begins to take hold, these reference points disappear, leaving a blank space where activity once lived. The psyche interprets this blankness as emptiness, not recognizing that it is simply unoccupied. This phase often triggers a subtle anxiety. Without drama to manage or crisis to resolve, you may feel restless, bored, or strangely disconnected from yourself. You might question whether something is wrong, whether you have lost passion or purpose. In reality, your system is recalibrating. It is learning how to exist without the constant release of stress hormones that once kept you alert and engaged. Peace removes the internal narrator that thrived on commentary and anticipation. The inner monologue quiets. Thoughts slow. Emotional reactions lose their edge. This silence can feel disorienting because so much of your identity was shaped around reaction. You knew who you were in response to others, in resistance to circumstances, in survival mode. Without those triggers, the self feels undefined. There is also a grief embedded in this emptiness. You grieve the intensity that once made you feel alive, even if it also exhausted you. You grieve the version of yourself who could endure anything, who stayed vigilant, who found meaning in struggle. Letting go of that identity feels like a small death. Peace asks you to release not only pain, but also the familiar sense of self that pain supported. As peace deepens, it exposes how much of your motivation was fear-based, deadlines driven by anxiety, relationships sustained by urgency, goals fueled by the need to prove worth or avoid loss. When those fears soften, motivation changes. You no longer feel pushed from behind. Instead, you are invited forward by choice. This shift can feel like inertia until you learn how to move without pressure. The emptiness of peace is not a void, but a pause. It is space returning to a psyche that was overcrowded with vigilance. In this space, emotions have room to settle rather than spike. Thoughts have room to pass rather than loop. The body begins to experience rest without collapse. This is a new sensation, and new sensations often feel neutral before they feel pleasant. Over time, the emptiness begins to soften. You start to notice subtler forms of satisfaction. Simple moments land more fully. Presence replaces anticipation. You are less concerned with what is coming next and more attuned to what is already here. Freedom does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly through these small shifts in attention. Peace also changes your relationship to time. Without urgency, time feels slower and more expansive. You are no longer racing toward relief or bracing for impact. This slower rhythm can initially feel unproductive, especially in cultures that equate worth with output. Learning to trust this rhythm requires unlearning the belief that rest is laziness or that stillness is stagnation. Eventually, peace reveals its deeper quality. It is not empty because nothing matters. It is open because nothing is pressing. You are no longer compelled to fill every moment with meaning or every silence with noise. Choice replaces compulsion. You act when it aligns, not when anxiety demands it. Freedom emerges not as excitement, but as ease, as the ability to exist without constant internal negotiation or defense